right, so we started with Joshua, or we started with Deuteronomy, where we talked about the Jews leaving Egypt. We'll hear that story, the climax of that story, Thursday night, the story of Passover. Spend time on Mount Sinai, did the covenant, spend time through the desert, got to the Holy Land, Moses dies, Joshua leads them into the Holy Land. They fight for it for a while. When Joshua dies, their leaders are basically local ones called judges. Eventually they get to have a king, Saul. And when he dies, David, and it's under David that they're at their highest peak. And then under Solomon, they're still strong, but they decline at the end because of some of his policies. When he dies, they divide into two countries, dividing over who should succeed him. Both countries get weaker. Over the course of the next 2 centuries, they get quite a bit weaker. The northern part gets taken over, and then over the course of the next many centuries, other countries take turns almost over who controls what we now call the Holy Land. So that is what we covered. The low point then being the exile, Babylonian exile in the 500s BC. They came back, not independently, but got to come back from their land, rebuilt the temple, but there's still other countries telling them what to do. And toward the end then, we did not do the books of Maccabees yet. We finished with the books that were around the exile, and then the prophets who were shortly after the exile. In the handout, I've got some information about storybooks, which are didactic, meant to teach us something, and we did do 2 of those earlier, Ruth and Jonah. And then there's 2 historical books, meaning based on historical events, being 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which aren't until they start taking place around 165 BC or so. Tonight was advertised, though, as being the night that we would cover the 7 wisdom books. So these books are totally different than all the other ones that we've done so far. There's no story about people and what's happening to them. And there's no emphasis on the nation of Israel. Instead, it's just talking about things of ordinary life. So when we say the wisdom books or the wisdom literature, we're talking about 7 books, one of which is called wisdom. So, in your Bible's table of contents, the 7 wisdom books are together. After those historical and story books, after 2nd Maccabees, it says Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Wisdom, and Sirach. Those are the 7 wisdom books. Protestants have the first 5. They do not have wisdom or Sirach. Sirach is sometimes called the wisdom of Ben Sirach. Ben in Hebrew means son of. So when you see son of Ben Sirach, it's son of Sirach. And they don't have wisdom, which we use so often at funerals. And the reason for that is, from back to the first time we met, written in Greek and written much later. So there are 5 books in the Protestant wisdom section, 7 books in the Catholic wisdom section. All right, so some of them are pretty long, so we don't have a lot of, can't go over real thoroughly. But for those, if you like to do biblical reading, these might be 7 of the better books to read, because you don't need to know history to understand these 7. And it's individual. These are the more individual books. They're not about the country of Israel. They're not about history. They're not about great leaders. They're about questions that we have in life. And they're called wisdom because people who put the Bible together said, yeah, these are very wise things that are good to know. So I'm just going to start with Sirach. It's the book of Sirach, and it might say Ecclesiasticus as opposed to Ecclesiastes. They come from the same root word, which today we often put together as church. So, book of Sirach or Ecclesiastes. And whenever I start a homily on these in church, and I have before, Sirach. So I'll often say this is basically a book of wisdom written by a father to his son, or maybe a grandfather to his grandson. So some wise things to keep in mind during life. And the people who put the Bible together said, yes, these are very good. So sometimes, well, okay, so everybody find it?
It's after wisdom.
Sirach is after the book of wisdom.
Wisdom of Ben Sirach, yeah.
That's the one you need then?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You said the word.
You need to mark your table of contents, that way when you have to go and find a book, you can do that, but these 7 are in order, and Sirach are all together, and Sirach, I think, is the last of the 7. So, also called Ecclesiasticus, written in the 2nd century BC. So 2nd century BC means from the 200s to the 100s, so probably in that 200 to 175 BC area. And you can tell by the headings over the chapters what they are about. A lot of people are surprised. They say, what's the most common thing talked about in the Old Testament? So faith is number 1. Wisdom is number 2. So it's talked about regularly. Many times wisdom is personified, always in the feminine. So I don't know if they thought women had more wisdom than men, but whenever, yeah, whenever they talk about wisdom, it's always she and her. So anyway, the first chapter praises wisdom, and then you can see what it's about. The second chapter is about your duties toward God. My son. So he's writing to his son. Here's what you need to do as far as your relationship with God goes. Chapter 3, your duties toward your parents. Concluding with the importance of giving to the poor. Right? And then we have things about rewards of wisdom, and then specific things, sincerity and justice in the middle of chapter 4. Against presumption in chapter 5. And a lot of these are really common, so I'll just go, suppose in chapter 5, verse 13. Be swift to hear, but slow to answer. If you have the knowledge, answer your neighbor. If not, put your hand over your mouth. Okay, so a lot of things like that. You know
That's
what
some
you're
real good advice.
Yes, if you know what you're going to say is right and true, then say it, otherwise be quiet. So there's a lot of things in there. A man's tongue can be his downfall. So again, lots of common sense, practical wisdom that you would teach your children, but probably could teach adults too. All right, chapter 7, how to act in public. You know, don't do evil things in public. Avoid wickedness. Duties of family, duties of religion, duties of charity. Chapter 8 is business dealings, how to deal with other people in business in a good way. Chapter 9, advice concerning women. In the second half of it, advice on friends. Yeah, you probably read the things about the women there. Yeah, don't fall into the snares.
Snare, no snares.
Keep
Keep our snares hidden.
And they are written poetically. So it took some skill to write them, so they would come out to make sense this way. Sin of pride. We start getting things here about how wisdom is really important, more important than money, more important than looks. We hear that about women, but even about men. Chapter 11, verse 2, praise not a man for his looks, and despise not a man for his appearance. So we shouldn't judge anybody by their looks, because their virtues and their wisdom is much more important than their looks. Okay, chapter 12, you do good to others, and here's how. Right before that was things about choosing friends. Chapter 13, how to be careful in your business dealings, who you associate with. Chapter 14, how to use your wealth. And in there it talks some phrases that basically you can't take it with you. Chapter 14, verse 20, happy the one who meditates on wisdom and reflects on knowledge. So it's wise to think about things like wisdom and knowledge, rather than some of the other things that we often overemphasize. First verse of chapter 14, happy the one whose mouth brings him no grief. Okay, so you don't get in trouble for what you say. And you can tell by some of the other titles there. So as I say, if you wanted to say, I want to do some easier Bible reading, yeah, read the 7 wisdom books. They're not real difficult, and they're very, very common sense oriented. Chapter 19, verse 6. Never repeat gossip, and you will not be reviled. Chapter 20, the difference between wise people and foolish people. Chapter 21, avoiding sin. Again, lots of things in the Bible. What's the opposite of wisdom? Foolishness. So, then again, there's another one again, relationships with spouses. Chapter 26, happy the husband of a good wife. Twice lengthened are his days. A worthy wife brings joy to her husband, and so on. Some people use that at weddings, and sometimes they use that at the funeral of a good woman. So that one concludes by saying, yeah, a good wife is a generous gift bestowed upon the one who fears the Lord. Whether he's rich or poor, his heart is content, and smile on his face when you have a good wife. Okay, and I'll just let you take a look at the headings over the rest of the chapters there. You could probably spend a few weeks if you wanted to read the book. Spend time to read a chapter a day or whatever, or 2 chapters a day, because it's not difficult to understand. It's common sense things. If I were to say, everybody come back next week with 5 nice lines that you like, you probably all have no difficulty doing that. And chapter 39 begins with how different the one who devotes himself to the study of the law of the Most High. So yeah, you're really wise if you're capable of that, studying God's law. And some are happy ones, some are kind of sad. It's the beginning of chapter 40. God has given us anxiety, a heavy yoke, from the time we leave our mother's womb to the day that we die. You know, there's always something burdening us. Father's care for his daughter in chapter 42. Which is nice because most of the time in the Bible they're talking about the value of sons. So anyway, here's a special section about the value of a daughter. Remember, we heard that from Ruth when they said that Ruth was as good as having 7 sons because she was such a good person. And then toward the end, like middle of chapter 44, it talks about the patriarchs and then Moses and Aaron. And chapter 46, Joshua, Caleb, and the judges. So they talk about some people from the past. Why? Because they're saying these are good examples of wise people from our history. So like for David, for example, like the choice fat of the sacred offerings, so was David in Israel. They do that a lot. You recognize that on the Sunday reading. They'll talk about something like, okay, how good the bad meat tastes, the juicy meat, how good that is compared to the rest. That's how David was. He was that much of a better leader than the other ones. So, 51 chapters of guidance that you give your younger people, or certainly even if you're old, you can certainly make good use of it as well.
See. Okay, I was looking at YouTube, because I've been listening to these on YouTube, they have different, and one is the King James Bible, and it has a book of Sirach. Is it King James, the
Okay.
Protestant?
You Protestants use the King James Version, but the
Right.
King James Version could have those books. in it.
Oh, okay. Okay, 'cause I found it.
Yes, the King James Version is the one that the people you see on TV, the evangelicals on TV usually use that version, but not all. We use the New American Bible in our church, but they're all okay. It's just a matter of how you translate. All right, so now we go to a similar book, the book of Proverbs, which is a little bit earlier, maybe about 4 books sooner. And you all know what a proverb is. It's basically a wise saying. What country is known for its proverbs? China. Yeah, so, you know, an ancient Chinese proverb says. Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, fortune cookies would be an example of that. Somebody said that, China maybe is, it's one of the oldest cultures, so that, there's lots of stuff on wisdom and proverbs there. So the book of Proverbs itself was probably put together over the course of time. Some people say, a lot of it is from Solomon. Maybe not. Remember, Solomon was supposed to be a really wise leader, at least during the first half of his reign. So if you put the name Solomon next to something, that's supposed to make you think, okay, this is good stuff, this is wise sayings. So Proverbs are simply wise sayings. And again here, it wouldn't even matter what order you read them, because these are just a collection of different wise sayings. And many times they're two sentences long, and maybe the first sentence will be something that's wise, and the second line something that's foolish, where 2 lines are contrasted. But again, you can look through these, and I'm sure there'll be many, when I gave assignments on this, people pick out something from them, look at this one, that makes sense. So, for example, I'm just going to do chapter 3, verse 13. Happy the one who finds wisdom, the one who gains understanding. For a prophet is better than profit in silver and better than gold. So, wisdom and knowledge are better than silver and gold. So I can say something without even pointing, but say to your neighbor, don't say to your neighbor, go and come tomorrow, I'll give you something, when you can give today. So if you can do something good today, do it today, not tomorrow. And many times, 2 lines will basically say the same thing. So 4:14. The path of the wicked enter not, walk not the way of evil people. 2 lines that say the same thing. Put away from you dishonest talk, deceitful speech, put far from you. Same thing, 2 lines that mean pretty much the same thing, so you put them together for emphasis. All right, and again, you can tell by the headings what some of them are about. And when you get to chapter 10, these are attributed to Solomon, may or may not be. But then, yeah, you're just gonna get quick one-liners in themselves. So the very first one in chapter 10. A wise son makes his father glad. A foolish son is a grief to his mother. Okay, so yeah, parents are happy if your son or daughter is wise. You're sadder if they're foolish. Ill-gotten treasures profit nothing, but virtue saves from death. So yeah, money isn't as important as virtue. So from chapter 10 on, yeah, that'd be, so again, you can do some daily reading, just some wise things, really easy to understand. Several chapters of, so chapter 10, for example, has 32 Proverbs. Chapter 11 has 31 Proverbs. You just kind of divide them up that way. A mild answer calms wrath. A harsh word stirs up anger. So when you're talking to somebody, talk nicely so they don't get upset, and then you'll be able to accomplish something. So, yep, this would be a very easy book. Doesn't need much explanation. You can read through them and see what you get from that. Yeah, how bad are foolish people? Face a bear robbed of her cubs, but never a fool in his folly. So yeah, it's safer to be around a bear that's lost her cubs than around a foolish person. Better a person who walks in integrity than one who is crooked in his ways and rich. So lots of them in here about virtue being more important than wealth. So you see chapter 10 through 22 is one-line Proverbs. Then when it gets midway through chapter 22, you go back to having more wise sayings that are a little bit longer. And then you get to chapter 25, and you get a second collection of Proverbs. And it starts by saying, yeah, we got these from Solomon, and you remember King Hezekiah was a pretty good king later on, says he transmitted them. Very last phrase of 25, like an open city with no defenses is the person with no check on his feelings. So if you can't control your feelings, you're like an undefended city. And so then you keep going with more one-liners. A rich person who oppresses the poor is like a devastating rain that leaves no food. So again, one of the worst things is somebody who takes advantage of the poor. You're probably familiar with 27:1. Boast not of tomorrow, for you know not what any day may bring. And then they do attribute chapter 30 to a different person, an unknown person. And 31, another person named Lemuel. And one that you might be familiar with because a lot of people like to use the last part of chapter 31 for their mother's funeral. So you probably heard that. When one finds a worthy wife, her value is beyond pearls. So, yeah, a good wife is better than pearls and so on. An unfailing prize. You can read through all the things there that a good woman does. And of course, back then, one of the main things she does is she can do so many things. She's strong arms, she can make cloth, has skillful hands. Rises before it's light to start getting food ready. wise enough in business, has sturdy arms for work, also reaches out her hands to the poor. Husband is proud of her. She speaks wisdom. And it concludes by saying, charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting. But the woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Yeah, charm, you might be charming, you might be beautiful, but you won't always be charming and beautiful, whereas you can always be virtuous.
Doesn't say that.
Cooking's not mentioned.
Yeah, you don't have to do that.
Well, she rises while it's still night and distributes food. To the girls.
Where? Yeah, that could be said.
That's breakfast in bed, just so you know.
Yeah, puts her hand to the distaff and her fingers to the spindle so she can sew clothes. And, but she's also smart, she knows what land to buy. So, and her children and her husband praise her. So that's again one that's probably the part that most people are familiar with, is the last chapter on the ideal life.
There's also one that says gray hair is a crown of glory. It is gained by virtuous living.
Yes.
Where do you at with that one?
Where's that one? I
Hallmark
want that one.
needs to get that one going.
That's gotta be put on a
Proverbs
pillow
16.
somewhere.
And it's number 31.
1631? I should go on a pillow or something.
Yeah, like I said, there's lots of them you can choose. You could probably find some, maybe you can pick out some things like.
And that's why I know color, right?
It's worded a little bit different, my version.
Oh, is it, what does your sign
Mine
say?
says that is just.
A hoary head is a crown of glory. It is gained in a righteous life.
A what head?
Hoary.
Or yeah, and that basically means you've lived a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hoary, H-O-A-R-Y.
I like mine better.
Like hoarfrost, like this.
This is
Yeah,
St.
hoarfrost,
Joseph's.
yeah, hoarfrost, yeah.
Yeah, St. Joseph's.
Everybody knows what gray means. You might not know what hoary means.
Yeah.
Just keep it on your script.
Yeah.
Either, I earned that
Okay,
right.
I never heard that either. so.
Yep, very good.
You're getting it too.
So, I could tell everybody here,
Can't wait
you've got
later.
2 books that you can read anytime. All right, and then next we'll go to Psalms, which is, I think, the book right before Proverbs. So, yeah, maybe the longest, and that's, of course, one that we read from Psalms every Sunday, right? Well, we usually sing one in between the first and second reading. All right, so the one thing about Psalms is, again, doesn't matter what order you read them because they're separate from one another. 150 separate songs. Just like if you went into the church and got our hymnal, and they're numbered 1 through 150 or whatever, that's what the book of Psalms is, 150 separate songs. So, some of these are among the oldest things in the Bible, and some are later, but these are probably songs written over the course of several centuries. So you could probably imagine, if we said, let's find 150 good church songs, you'd probably find some that were pretty recent and some that go back centuries. So that's the same thing here with the book of Psalms. So again, when you talk about Psalms, you don't say chapter 2, you say Psalm 2. They're not chapters, they're individual songs. And many times, for those of you who like music, or if we had our musicians here, a song leader, they'll even say, for the leader with wind instruments, or stringed instruments, they'll even say what instruments they used when they played this particular song.
I have a question.
Yep.
I've seen this before, Sheila. It's at the end of something, it'll say Sheila. What does that mean?
Okay, take a,
Shayla?
yeah, then you take a look at your asterisk down below, it'll give you an answer to that.
It occurs 71 times.
What is it?
Oh, okay,
It-
yeah,
It's directions.
Oh, it's instructions?
yep, instructions, yep, good. So some psalms are shorter, some are longer. Psalm 2 and Psalm 110 are specifically songs that were written for the coronation of a new king. So just like when we have a new president, there's certain things that we do. Okay, back in Israel's time when they got a new king, those were 2 songs that they sang. And many times it'll say what the psalm is about. So Psalm 5 will say, well, it's asking for God's help. Psalm 6, when you're in distress. So really you could find, again, if you want to take your time to do so, again, you could probably find a psalm for any occasion. There's happy ones, there's sad ones, there's ones for coronation of a king, there's ones for when you're sick, there's some for when you're feeling really down, so you can find them for about any occasion. Every now and then, you will see different lettering for Psalms, and that is because of Psalm 9 is really long. So, mine even says 9, 10 together. Some don't have that, so that's why in some Bibles, for example, Psalm 95 might be Psalm 94 in another one. The reason for that is the way Psalm 9 is described, or the way it's lettered.
Mine's gotta go in the Roman numerals.
So, Psalm 13 is when you're ill, God, have you forgotten me? I'm in trouble here, so do something to help. Psalm 16, keep me safe, O God, in you I take refuge. So, all different kinds there, and of course one that we just heard in church on Sunday, they talked about the homily, was the psalm that we used last Sunday, Psalm 22. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why are you so far? I call by name, but you don't answer. But I know you're there. And by the time we get to the end, it says, even though there's bad things going on around me, I put my trust in God. It talks about dogs surrounding me, like evildoers are surrounding me. But by the end, still praising God. Probably the most known one is Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, there's nothing I shall want. Green pastures, he gives me repose, lets me graze.
Father Randy.
Mhm.
So, the gospel reading mentioned that there was an eclipse on the day that Jesus died. So, and then Catholic Radio mentioned, it says that they figure that Jesus died in the year 30